In this video, we'll be looking at creating a continuous integration and continuous delivery pipeline, which will deploy our booking service API to an Azure container app whenever we push changes to the repository. Let's get right into it. Go to dev.azure.com. Let's go into our project pipelines, and then under pipeline, let's create a new pipeline. Let's select where our code is hosted. In our case, is GitHub. Let's select our repository. We're going to just select a random template because we're not going to use it. Now go to project settings, and under service connections, let's create a new service connection to Microsoft Azure. Select Azure Resource Manager. Then we're going to start with Service Principal. That's how we're going to access our subscription. Confirm the two-factor authentication and select the subscription. Select the resource group. We created the resource group up front. For now, let's grant it permissions to all pipelines. Now, let's look at the Service Principal in Microsoft Azure itself. As we can see, it's created and it's in good standing. Now we're going to give it some RBAC, role-based access control permissions. We're going to grant it the contributor role. Later in the playlist, we are going to grant it access only to the resource group because the contributor role is too broad. Just select the members. For service principal, we have to type in some text. It doesn't auto-populate. Select it. Next. Review and assign it. Now that that's done, under pipelines and library, we're going to create our variable group, which will host all of our variables. So in our pipeline itself, we won't be using any coded variables. Let's get the container registries password and other variables into the variable group. Let's create our first pipeline. Go to pipelines and select new pipeline. Select where you're hosting your code. Select your repository. Let's just rename it to infra for now. Basically going to be, I see the typo by the way, it's going to later be support services, for example our database and our message brokers. Let's reference our variable group. Perfect. And then let's create a stage which will deploy our RabbitMQ container app for Azure container. There we go. Container apps deploy. Let's select the connection that we created to Microsoft Azure, the Docker image to pull. We're going to pull RabbitMQ 3-management tag, and then we're going to use our variables throughout. Just disable telemetry as well. No one wants that. Okay, let's format it correctly there. And then what we're going to require next is through the Azure CLI task, we are going to modify the RabbitMQ container apps ingress to be set explicitly to TCP and set the port accordingly. We don't want it to default to auto, which might take time trying to find out whether it's HTTP or TCP. We're going to do the same for our Postgres database. Ideally, it should be in Azure database for Postgres. Let's update our variables in our variable group. Let's add the RabbitMQ password. Right, next we're going to create an Azure Log Analytics workspace. This is where all apps in the container apps environment are going to log, whether it's system or console logs. Just go to Microsoft Azure and search for Log Analytics. Create a new Log Analytics workspace. Select your resource group, give it a name, and put it in a region closer to your client's region. It's created. Now, if you go back to your container apps environment and under logging options, just select Azure Log Analytics, select the resource group that you placed it in, and then select your Log Analytics workspace. Save changes. Let's look at it in Azure. Our resource group currently just has the environment. Let's save this particular pipeline. You just have to change the name there, but I'll change it later. Let's permit some of the required permissions to access the variable group to the pipeline. Let the pipeline run. Once it's done, if we go back to Azure to our resource group and refresh, we'll see that we have our database and our RabbitMQ container apps. If we go to revisions and replicas, we'll see that they are both running at max. The max is set to 1 instance, minimum and max. All right. Now let's create another pipeline to actually deploy our actual booking service. Let's just rename the pipeline itself so we can differentiate them. New pipeline, GitHub, what we did before. We're going to check out and remember the sub-modules that we're using. And then we're simply going to build the Docker image using the build ID. It'll reference our Docker file that was generated by Visual Studio, and then we just modified it a little bit. Next, we're going to point our latest Docker image tag to the latest image that we've built. So latest always has the latest image. Here's an example of just removing all hard-coded variables and then using variables from a variable group. Let's execute our pipeline to create our booking service container app in Microsoft Azure. Once it has completed its execution, we are going to check our logs in our log analytics workspace. As you can see, the relation bookings, which is an expected database, is not present. Why? Because we did not execute our database migration script on our Postgres database. Let's create a new pipeline to simplify that process. It will be an on-demand pipeline. Next, we are going to create a pipeline environment which will allow us to have approvers approve a particular pipeline's execution. This is a security measure so senior personnel can actually approve deployments to particular environments. We're going to launch a new container app job, which will connect to our Postgres instance and then modify it with our current idempotent SQL script. It's important because if it executes multiple times, we don't want it to make changes. So let's create our container app job. And let's just make it to execute. I include it as a pipeline so things are easier. We don't want cases whereby we execute code on a local machine in a production environment, for example. As we've done with the other pipelines, the Docker image tag that we used is the build ID. What we're going to do now is point the latest tag to this latest build ID tag. Now, let's just show how we actually create a container app job in the Azure portal. So just go to your container apps environment, go down to apps. And if you click on create, there'll be an option to create a container app or create a container app job, which is on demand. So it just executes and then it exits. Let's give our pipelines logical names. Let's execute our DB migrator pipeline. Okay, let's create a few bookings to verify that Postgres actually persists the data that we send to it and that messages are actually sent to RabbitMQ to be picked up by consumers. You can list bookings and everything works as it's supposed to. So it publishes a message to RabbitMQ to be consumed by any registered consumer. After the consumer receives the message, it processes it and then the database is subsequently updated. Let's build upon this in our next episode.